Okay, in this lecture I'm going to walk us through reading 5, which is a chapter, I think chapter 3 out of Marvin Harris's book on culture materialism, which is one of the more popular and significant theories of religion. Well, theories of culture in general, but certainly can be applied to religion as we're doing it here. First, though, I'd like to begin with the diagram. So if you could access that, pull it out, we'll take a look at it. All right, first, you'll note you see two terms, etic and emic. In case I haven't said anything about them yet, etic refers to actions and behavior, what people are doing. Emic refers to the insider's point of view, what they're thinking about things and what they say they're thinking about things. And as you will see as we go through culture materialism emphasizes the etic aspect of human behavior because frankly it just tends to be much more trustworthy. And also, if you aspire to an empirical scientific analysis, then you certainly want to give primacy to etic behavior and not emic behavior, which is notoriously unreliable. So that's the two terms they're very important for us. And you can see the organizational scheme here. On the far left you have infrastructure. These are activities that are most crucial in regard to human survival. You see production and reproduction. Excuse me. And of course production has to do with feeding ourselves, producing food, other things you see there, subsistence technology. And then of course reproduction is simply procreation. You see all the different aspects of reproduction there. But these activities are most crucial for human survival. So in other words, the logic here, at least from the culture materialist standpoint, is that people are going to be mostly concerned with these activities, right? These requirements must be met. Regardless of whatever else you're doing or thinking, you must tend to these. You will note right to the left of the etic behavioral infrastructure, you see the nature-culture interface, which means that on the left side of the diagram, like out there in that margin, that's nature. Everything within this rectangular box is culture. And so these production and reproduction bring us closest to nature. That's why you see it right next to the nature-culture interface. Okay, as we move out from there, we find the ways that people organize themselves so they can accomplish production and reproduction, namely structure. And you see the things under there, family structure, enculturation, which is the process whereby we learn our culture, sex roles, political organizations, class, caste, military, etc. These are the ways we organize the doing of production and reproduction. And then finally, there are those activities that are neither crucial to our survival nor involve the organization of accomplishing things that are crucial to our survival. And they have a tertiary significance, right? Primary, secondary, tertiary. And you see them, art, music, dance, and so forth. And then in a sort of way, kind of underlying all of these, at the bottom right-hand corner, you see the mental and emic superstructure. Well, these are, this has to do with ideology, what people think about these things, how we rationalize the things we do, and so forth. So that's where the ideology, or the beliefs, the religious dogma comes from. And cultural materialism assumes that most human behavior can be attributed to the doing of production or reproduction. That is the category thought to be most influential. So the basic idea is that material factors have a great influence on human behavior. It's not that these other things are insignificant. In fact, as you can see in the reading, Marvin Harris says these things, structure and superstructure, may even take on an independent sort of existence once they're originated. But again, they're not crucial to our survival the way that production and reproduction are. Okay, now let us look at your reading, reading 5. It's chapter 3. And you can see the title is Theoretical Principles of Cultural Materialism. Here's where Harris really breaks down his theoretical approach. He starts off by making a distinction by drawing a distinction between emics and edics. We've already talked about that. As he mentions, right now I'm on the first page, page 46. He mentions that this paradigm is not idealist. In other words, it's not drawn from an emic perspective. And as you can see, the bottom sentence there on page 46, going up into page 47, he writes, on the other hand, cultural materialists approach the definition of social and cultural phenomena initially, but not exclusively, from an edic perspective. And on page 47, about eight lines down, he notes that the starting point of our analysis from a cultural materialistic perspective is simply the existence of an edic human population located in edic time and space. Now, in the next couple of pages, he critiques other scholars' attempts to kind of analytically break down the components of society. And Harris's main complaint with these other attempts is that people don't make a distinction. These scholars aren't making the distinction between emic and edic. And I agree with Harris that is important. I mean, especially in regard to religion, right? Because, I mean, I think we all know intuitively, don't we, that a believer's perspective is notoriously unreliable in regard to discovering the truths of a particular religion, right? I mean, they're going to be cheerleaders for the religion. Everything is going to be painted with a rosy brush, right? You may get a totally different take on things just simply through your observation of how they actually act and what they're actually doing. All right. On page 51, under that heading, he writes, the universal structure of sociocultural systems posited by cultural materialism rest on the biological and psychological constants of human nature and on the distinction between thought and behavior and emics and edicts. And here he mentions the edict behavioral mode of production and reproduction as being of having a primary influence. And next he discusses the structure and superstructure. And so basically he sort of breaks down that chart that we just discussed. So these next couple of pages are really good for you to go back through again. But I won't repeat what's said here because we went through that when we went over the diagram. And he does simplify it. You can see near the bottom, page 53, he simplifies it. And he says it yields a tripartite scheme: infrastructure, structure, and superstructure. And he mentions right below that is that running roughly parallel to these edict behavioral components are mental components whose conventional designations are as follows. And he gives us the corresponding emic aspects of infrastructure, then structure, then superstructure. And as he said, he lumps all of these together in one category, the mental and emic superstructure. And he, right above the heading language again, he summarizes the four major universal components of sociocultural systems are now before us as the edict behavioral infrastructure, structure and superstructure, and the mental and emic superstructure. So the four basic components. He does mention that language, you'll note, is not excuse me, overtly part of his scheme. And that's because language pretty much overlaps all of these different things in one way or another. So you can't really bracket it or isolate it from these four different components. So that's what he has to say about language and the reason why it's not included in his scheme. Then under the major principles of cultural materialism, he notes that the kernel of the principles, the basic idea, came from Marx. And there's a nice quote from Marx. This is on page 55. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. That's why many scholars like Marx and Feuerbach, even Aristotle, noted that men make gods in their own image. And so that's where that basic notion comes from. And on the bottom of page 55, moving to page 56, important passage, he gives us what he says is the principle of infrastructural determinism. Namely, the edict behavioral modes of production and reproduction probabilistically determine the edict behavioral domestic and political economy, which in turn probabilistically determine the behavioral and mental emic superstructures, sorry. You can see he uses the term probabilistically, right, which says that there is a very high chance that you can attribute human cultural behavior to infrastructural activities. And he sort of repeats that. Look on page 56, about 7 lines down. Cultural materialists give the highest priority to the effort to formulate and test theories in which infrastructural variables are the primary causal factors. And drop down another important passage, about 10 lines below that on page 56. In other words, cultural materialists assert the strategic priority of etic and behavioral conditions and processes over emic and mental conditions and processes, and of infrastructural over structural and superstructural conditions and processes. But it does not deny the possibility that emic, mental, superstructural, and structural components may achieve a degree of autonomy from the etic behavioral infrastructure. That's a point I made a while ago. Okay. And then he discusses infrastructure a bit more. A nice passage on page 57, the first indented paragraph. Infrastructure, in other words, is the principal interface between culture and nature, the boundary across which the ecological, chemical, and physical restraints to which human action is subject interact with the principal sociocultural practices aimed at overcoming or modifying those restraints. The order of cultural materialist priorities from infrastructure to the remaining behavioral components, and finally to the mental, that's the emic superstructure, reflects the increasing remoteness of these components from the culture-nature interface. About 5 lines below that, he writes, to endow the mental superstructure with strategic priority, as cultural idealists advocate, is a bad bet. And here is a very good quote for you to remember. Let's look at it. Nature is indifferent to whether God is a loving father or a bloodthirsty cannibal. But nature is not indifferent to whether the fallow period in a Swidden field is 1 year or 10. Well, first of all, let me explain the terminology. A fallow period, that's the period that after you've planted for so long in a certain area. Now remember, we're talking primarily horticultural societies practicing slash and burn agriculture. So they will go into an area, they will burn the forest, they'll clear it out. Of course, they'll leave the huge trees where they stand, and then they'll just plant right there. You can do that for about 8 to 10 years or so until you begin to leach all the nutrients out of the soil and you can no longer grow anything. Well, that means you have to pull up stakes and leave the land alone so we can regenerate. That's the fallow period. A Swidden field has to do with slash and burn agriculture. So what is Harris saying here? Harris is saying that, for example, let's say you're homesteading in a plot of land in some area, wherever it may be. Well, there are certain things that you have to be careful about if you're planting and harvesting in a particular area. There's general climate, then there's weather, which is a more acute manifestation of climate, right? There may be geographical concerns, irrigation concerns, seasonal issues. All of these things must be tended to, and they must be taken seriously right? That's what nature, quote unquote, cares about. Of course, nature is not a conscious ontological entity, but these are the things that nature cares about. Meaning that if you want to succeed, you will abide by nature's requirements. But now, how many gods you're worshiping, whether or not you're worshiping God, how you worship God, all of these things are totally irrelevant in regard to following nature's dictates, in regard to planting and harvesting in that land. You see his point? So that shows the primacy of the infrastructural aspects of culture. They must be tended to. Okay, I'm going to conclude this part of the lecture and we're going to pick it up in a part 2.